1347. The gate closed with a sound that none of them forgot. Not loud, not dramatic, just wood meeting iron, the kind of noise that says a choice has already been made and cannot be taken back. Only hours earlier, the road had still felt safe. The women had been riding under protection, moving between estates near the marches of northern France, where land changed hands often enough that everyone learned to live alert. Their escorts were armed, their banners known. The day felt ordinary in the way dangerous days often do. Then came the shout from the hedgerow, then the rush of hooves, then the sound of steel striking steel, sharp and close, far too close. It ended fast. Some of the guards were killed where they fell. Others ran when the line broke. The horses screamed. One woman was dragged from her saddle by accident, not cruelty, her foot caught in a strap until someone cut it free. When the dust settled, the road no longer belonged to them. The banners were gone. The men standing around them spoke in another accent, rougher, flatter, used to command. They waited for what came next. The stories they had grown up with left little room for doubt. Every noble household carried its warnings, passed from older women to younger ones, spoken low but often. Castles taken, women taken. What followed was usually left unsaid, because everyone already knew how to fill the silence. So when hands did not reach for them, confusion struck almost as hard as fear. The knights who now controlled the road did not crowd them. They did not pull at veils or laugh too close. Orders were given instead. One man checked the flanks. Another sent riders ahead. A third told them to keep moving, his tone flat, almost bored. When a younger soldier stared too long at one of the women, a mounted knight snapped at him sharply, using his name, loud enough for everyone to hear. The look that followed was not gentle. It was corrective. They were made to ride again, their pace set by the slowest horse. At a stream crossing, a knight dismounted to steady an older lady whose legs shook from shock. He did not touch her again once she reached the far bank. Another adjusted a cloak that had slipped from a girl's shoulders, tugging it back into place as if closing a door rather than offering comfort. No one explained anything. By nightfall, the women understood that they were not being hurried for sport. They were being transported. The road led away from the border, toward stone houses and fields already harvested, toward land that belonged to the men walking beside them. Near the outskirts of a fortified manor outside Calais, the gates opened without argument. Torches were lit. The horses were taken. The women were led inside, single file, into a hall that smelled of damp wood and old smoke. Here, at last, came structure. A steward stood at a table with parchment and ink. He did not look up right away. A chaplain stood nearby, hands folded, eyes sharp. One by one, the women were asked their names, their fathers' names, their husbands' names, which lands they were tied to, who governed those lands in their absence. Each answer was repeated aloud and written down. When one woman hesitated, the steward waited without impatience, quill lifted, as if silence itself were part of the record. Their purses were taken, rings were removed. Small knives sewn into hems were found and set aside. Nothing was thrown away. Everything was counted. Everything was kept. Plain garments were brought out. Clean, undyed, practical. The message was clear even without words. You will be kept, not honored, not harmed. Kept. They were shown to an upper chamber with narrow windows and a heavy door. Straw pallets lined the walls. 2 female servants slept near the hearth. A guard took position outside, visible through the crack when the door closed. Inside, the women stood still for a long moment, listening to their own breathing. One of them finally spoke, her voice barely steady. She said what all of them were thinking. that nothing had happened, that it did not make sense. An older widow answered without turning around. She said their bodies were not spared out of care. They were spared because they belonged to someone who could pay. The words settled heavily, but they made the night easier to survive. But safety without freedom carries its own weight, and the women would soon learn that restraint can be as frightening as force. Morning arrived without ceremony. No bells, no announcement, just the scrape of boots in the corridor and the sound of a bolt sliding back into place. A servant entered with water and bread, her eyes down, her movements practiced. She did not speak unless spoken to. When one of the noblewomen asked where they were, the servant paused, glanced toward the door, and said only the name of the manor and the lord who held it. Nothing more. Information, like everything else here, was rationed. The women were counted before they ate, again after, again before dusk. It took little time to notice the pattern. Every action around them followed a rule they could not see but could feel. Guards changed at regular hours. Doors opened only in pairs. No man entered the chamber alone. When the women were escorted to the chapel, the chaplain walked ahead, the guards behind, as if distance itself were part of the design. One afternoon, a knight came with the steward to inspect the chamber. He did not sit. He did not smile. He stood near the door and listened while the steward spoke about arrangements, about space, about the need to keep the women separate from the lower household. When the knight's gaze brushed across them, it moved the way one inspects a horse or a chest, slow and careful, looking for damage. After they left, one of the younger women asked what kind of men went to such trouble. A middle-aged lady answered that these were men who expected to be paid. The discipline extended even to speech. Guards did not trade insults or jokes with the women. If spoken to, they answered plainly or not at all. One man, older than the rest, warned a younger guard to mind his tongue when he laughed too freely near the door. The warning was quiet, but it worked. The laughter stopped. At meals, the women sat together at a side table in the hall, close enough to be seen, far enough to be separated. They ate the same food as the household, no better and no worse. Bread that tore at the crust, pottage thick with peas, fish when it arrived from the coast, salted hard enough to sting the tongue, wine watered down until it tasted more like habit than pleasure. They were not guests. They were not prisoners in chains. They occupied a narrower place between. That place became clearer when letters were discussed. A clerk was brought in with parchment and ink. He explained the rules without apology. Letters could be sent, but only dictated. Names, sums, promises, all recorded. No private marks, no folded scraps hidden in sleeves. When one woman protested that her husband would know her hand, the clerk replied that the seal would speak louder than handwriting. One woman tried to plead directly with a knight she thought sympathetic. He listened, face still, then shook his head once and said that any request went through the steward. He added, almost kindly, that breaking order helped no one. At night, the women talked in low voices, mapping the logic of their captivity the way others mapped roads. They spoke of who among them would be ransomed first. Widows with lands of their own, daughters tied to powerful houses, wives whose husbands held command. They spoke less of the girl whose father was dead and whose brother had not yet come of age. One evening, raised voices broke the routine. A maidservant fled down the passage, her hair loose, her breath sharp with panic. A foot soldier followed, angry, careless. He did not reach her. 2 guards seized him before he crossed the threshold of the chamber. He was dragged into the yard. The beating carried through stone and wood alike. Every strike meant to be heard. The next morning, the man was gone. No explanation was offered. None was needed. The message was as clear as the rules that shaped their days. Disorder was punished not because it was wrong, but because it threatened value. The women spoke about it among themselves, and no one pretended otherwise. They understood now that restraint was not the absence of danger. It was danger managed. Every smile from a guard meant nothing. Every courtesy came with a boundary. Every night the door was barred, not to protect them, but to preserve them. Their safety depended not on conscience, but on balance sheets written in another room. And yet, knowing this did not make sleep easier, because if restraint was a rule, rules could change. If value protected them, value could fall. The women lay awake listening to the manor settle, to the wind against the shutters, to footsteps that passed and did not stop, learning how fragile their position truly was. But understanding the rules did not mean understanding the cost, and the price of being worth something would soon become painfully clear. The ledger came out on the third day. It was thick, bound in worn leather, its pages already crowded with names from other seasons of war. The steward placed it on the table as if setting down a weapon. One by one, the women were called forward again, not to speak this time, but to be measured in quieter ways. What lands did they bring with them? What rights followed their name? Who would answer if a demand arrived sealed in wax? The questions were never asked directly. They were spoken between men, in the women's presence, as if discussing weather or grain prices. The women listened, understanding far more than the steward expected. They had grown up inside these systems. They knew how marriage contracts worked. They knew how widows were weighed against heirs. They knew how bloodlines turned into numbers when written by someone with ink and authority. One knight leaned over the table and tapped a line with his finger. He said one woman's ransom would be simple. Her husband still held his lands. His coffers were known. Another knight said the next would take longer. Her father was dead. Her brothers were divided. The steward nodded and marked the margin. The woman stood there, hearing herself reduced to a problem of timing. After that, the treatment made more sense. Why the women were kept clean. Why no one raised a hand. Why even insults were rare. Damage would lower worth. Fear could be useful. Injury was not. The women were allowed to walk the inner courtyard under guard. It was not a kindness. It was maintenance. Pale captives alarm families. Sick captives slow negotiations. Each step they took around the worn stones was part of keeping them presentable for a future exchange they could not control. One afternoon, a broker arrived. He was not dressed like a knight. No armor, no badge of loyalty. He carried papers, seals, and a familiarity with both sides of the war. He spoke softly, smiled often, and treated the women as if they were already absent, already spoken for. He discussed routes, safe conduct, deadlines, guarantees. His language was smooth, but the meaning was sharp. Every delay carried a cost. Every failure to pay shifted leverage. The women learned then that ransom was not a single demand, but a process that could stretch, bend, and bruise. They began to mark time not by days, but by changes. A new guard rotation, a shift in tone when a messenger returned empty-handed, the steward's jaw tightening when a reply was late. The women noticed which names were spoken less often, which ones drew sighs. At night, they spoke openly now. One woman admitted she feared her husband would wait, believing delay might lower the price. Another said her brother would borrow heavily rather than leave her here. A third said nothing at all, staring at the wall where the torchlight left dark stains like old watermarks. They were not protected as people. They were protected as promises. That distinction settled into them slowly, like cold into stone. No one needed to threaten them. The structure did all the work. Their future depended on men they could not see, on harvests already gathered, on debts already owed, on alliances already strained. One evening, the steward entered with news. 2 letters had arrived. One ransom was agreed. Another was being negotiated. The steward read the terms aloud, careful, exact. When he finished, one woman was told to prepare. She would be moved within days. The room reacted in small ways. Relief for her, fear for the rest, envy that no one admitted. She packed in silence, folding borrowed garments, leaving behind nothing that belonged to her. Before she left, she turned to the others and said she would not forget them. No one answered. They had learned how fragile promises could be. After she was gone, the chamber felt larger and more exposed. The women who remained understood something then that had not been clear before. Being valuable did not mean being secure. It meant being delayed, repositioned, calculated again and again until someone decided the numbers were acceptable. The restraint they lived under was not fixed. It rose and fell with negotiations they never witnessed. It could tighten without warning. It could loosen without explanation. Their safety rested on forces as impersonal as weather and just as indifferent. They were not waiting for mercy. They were waiting for agreement. But waiting has a way of pressing inward, and as the calculations continued, the cost of being worth something began to show. Routine became the sharpest tool of all. Once the rules were clear, the days settled into a pattern that was both merciful and suffocating. The women woke at the same hour, ate at the same table, walked the same stretch of stone under the same watchful eyes. Nothing was random, nothing was private. The predictability steadied the nerves at first, then slowly wore them down. They were allowed work because idle captives were harder to manage. One mended linen for the household. Another sorted herbs with a servant who spoke little but listened well. A third embroidered a small altar cloth for the chapel, not out of devotion, but because her hands needed something to do. Work made the hours pass and gave the guards fewer reasons to hover. It also reminded the women who they had once been and who they were no longer allowed to be. Conversation became careful. Every word spoken within stone walls had weight. The women learned to talk about weather, food, and sleep while saving truth for the dark hours when the servants rested and the guards shifted farther down the corridor. Even then, voices stayed low. Not because they feared punishment, but because habit had trained them to measure sound. One night, a young woman broke. She had received no letter, no word, no estimate. She said her family must think her already lost. She said she could feel herself fading from their plans. Another woman took her hands and spoke plainly. She said families did not forget value. They delayed it. She said hope here was not a feeling, but a calculation. The words helped, but not much. Letters arrived irregularly. Some brought relief. Others brought nothing but questions and careful phrases that avoided numbers. One woman learned that her estate was being disputed while she waited. Another learned that her husband had been wounded and could not travel to negotiate. Each message reshaped the chamber, shifting the balance between patience and panic. The guards noticed these changes even if they did not comment. A woman who lost hope moved differently. She ate less. She spoke less. The steward took note. He adjusted arrangements. Hope, too, was part of the investment. Occasionally, a visitor arrived to look at them. Not a gawking crowd. Just 1 or 2 men with authority, escorted by the steward, observing quietly. They asked no questions. They simply confirmed that the captives remained intact, calm, and presentable. Afterward, the rules tightened for a few days. Then they eased again. The women learned to read these signs the way farmers read clouds. They also learned how uneven waiting could be. One woman received news quickly. Her family had gathered the sum without argument. She was moved within a fortnight, her departure efficient and quiet. Another waited far longer, her name mentioned often, but always followed by hesitation. Her family negotiated every detail, weighing silver against future advantage. The difference cut deep. The women spoke about fairness once, then never again. Fairness had no place here. Only position did. As time stretched on, the body began to react to what the mind tried to manage. Sleep grew shallow. Small noises carried too much meaning. A footstep outside the door could send hearts racing, not because violence was expected, but because change always brought risk. One evening, the steward entered with an unfamiliar tone. He said arrangements were shifting. Several captives would be moved deeper inland, not as punishment, for security. The border was unstable, rescue attempts were possible, assets needed protection. The word assets was not spoken, but everyone heard it. The journey that followed was quieter than the first capture, but heavier. Fewer guards, tighter formation, less explanation. The women rode again, passing villages where people stared without comment. They were housed in another manner, older and colder, where the same rules applied with sharper edges. Here, the waiting deepened. The women leaned on one another more openly now. They shared stories from before the war, not to escape the present, but to anchor themselves in something that existed outside negotiation. They laughed once, briefly, at a memory of spilled wine at a wedding feast. The sound surprised them all. Then it passed. Because waiting was not empty. It was active. It worked on them daily, shaping how they stood, how they spoke, how they thought of themselves. They were untouched, yet altered, preserved, yet worn. They understood now that captivity did not need chains to bind. Time itself could do the work. But as the waiting dragged on, another truth surfaced, colder than fear. Not every name carried the same weight, and the price of a person could rise or fall without warning. The difference revealed itself in silence first. One woman stopped being mentioned. Her name, once spoken often by the steward and the clerk, no longer appeared in conversation. When letters arrived, they were read around her, not to her. When messengers came, their eyes slid past her place at the table. Nothing was said aloud, but everyone noticed. In this place, absence of words carried meaning. She asked one night what it meant. A woman who had already been moved once and returned for lack of payment answered carefully. She said it meant her family was bargaining too hard or not at all. She said delay was sometimes strategy. She also said delay could mean abandonment disguised as patience. The ransom process was never equal, and the women now saw it clearly. Those tied to powerful men were resolved quickly. A husband with command, a brother with allies, a mother who controlled estates. Their names moved along the chain like coins passed hand to hand. Others stalled, widows with contested lands, daughters whose marriages had not yet fixed their value, women whose families had lost favor before the war ever reached them. The captors noticed these differences and adjusted accordingly. Guards lingered longer near those with uncertain prospects. Letters were fewer. Conversations with stewards grew shorter. No threats were made. None were needed. The women felt the shift in attention like a change in weather. One afternoon, the broker returned with a different tone. He spoke of deadlines, of diminishing patience, of costs added quietly for housing, feeding, guarding. He explained that ransom was not static. Every day carried a fee. Every delay changed the balance. One woman asked what happened if payment never came. The broker looked at her for a long moment before answering. He said such cases were rare. He said arrangements were always found. He did not explain what kind. That night, sleep did not come easily. The women spoke more openly than before, voices low but steady. One admitted her family might choose land over her. Another said she feared being married off as part of settlement rather than returned. A third wondered aloud whether being untouched truly meant being spared or simply postponed. The oldest among them spoke last. She said war did not measure people by suffering, but by leverage. She said survival here depended on how useful a life remained to others. Days later, the steward announced another release. Witnesses were named. The sum had been agreed. The woman chosen was one whose ransom had never been in doubt. She prepared quickly, her movements precise, her face composed. Before leaving, she took each of the others by the hand. She said their names aloud, one by one, as if marking them against erasure. After she was gone, the room felt thinner. Those who remained now carried the weight of comparison. Every delay sharpened the question no one wanted to ask. Why her, not me? The captors did not grow cruel. They grew distant. Distance was safer than attachment. It preserved order. It protected calculation. The women learned that even restraint could cool into neglect if value became uncertain. Another letter arrived weeks later, sealed and careful. One woman learned her family could pay only part of the sum. Negotiations would continue. Time would be needed. The steward read the message aloud without expression. When he finished, he folded the parchment and said nothing more. That woman said nothing either. She simply sat down and stared at the floor, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The others watched, understanding that ransom was no longer just about money. It was about priority, about who mattered enough to hurry for. The waiting now carried a sharper edge. Every sound of hooves raised hope and fear in equal measure. Every delay carved doubt deeper. They were no longer just captives. They were comparisons made flesh. They understood then that names were not equal. Some opened doors. Others stalled negotiations. Some summoned urgency. Others invited patience until patience turned into forgetting. The restraint that had once felt structured now felt conditional. And in that uncertainty, the women faced the hardest truth of all. Survival did not depend on innocence, courage, or endurance, but on how loudly the world beyond these walls still spoke their name. But even as the price of each life was weighed and reweighed, the end approached quietly, bringing release that would leave marks no coin could erase. Release did not arrive with celebration. There was no speech, no apology, no attempt to soften what had been done. It came as procedure, delivered in the same tone as counting bread or assigning guards. The steward entered early, parchment in hand. He read names. 2 would leave. The sums had been agreed, the guarantees secured. The rest would remain until further notice. The words landed quietly, but they changed the shape of the room at once. Preparation followed at speed. Borrowed garments were returned. Rings and purses were brought back out and checked against the list. Each item was matched carefully, because mistakes at this stage invited dispute. The women chosen for release were escorted to wash, not for comfort, but for appearance. They were to cross a line soon, and they needed to look like what they were being exchanged for. At the boundary stone outside the manor, witnesses gathered. Not many, just enough. Coin was counted slowly, stacked and restacked, each piece inspected. Seals were checked. Names were read aloud again. Only then were the women guided forward. No one touched them as they crossed. On the other side waited men from their own lands, tense and formal, eyes fixed on the exchange rather than on the women themselves. Only once the final mark was made did arms reach out. The moment was brief, restrained, shaped by habit. Even reunion followed rules. The ride home felt longer than the journey into captivity. The land looked familiar, but not comforting. The women noticed small things they had ignored before. How easily a road could be blocked. How exposed a farm looked without men nearby. How quiet a village could be when war had passed through and taken what it needed. At home, they were received as intact, untouched, safe. And yet, something had shifted. They were asked questions that circled what mattered without naming it. Had they been treated well? Had they been harmed? Had anything improper occurred? The answers were simple. No, no, no. The relief was visible. The households moved on quickly, eager to close the account. But the women did not move on so easily. They remembered the counting, the waiting, the way value rose and fell without warning. They remembered the woman whose name stopped being spoken. They remembered how restraint felt less like care and more like storage. One woman refused to ride near the border again. Another insisted on overseeing her own accounts. A third watched negotiations differently now, understanding what delay could mean when a person became a line on parchment. They had returned alive, but altered. The lesson followed them quietly. Survival in war is not always about strength or virtue. Sometimes it is about being useful to the right people at the right moment. Sometimes it is about being worth more intact than broken. That knowledge did not fade. It lived in how they raised their daughters, in how they advised their sons, in how they measured alliances and promises. They spoke less of honor and more of leverage, less of stories and more of structures. And when war came again, as it always did, they understood its shape more clearly than most. They knew that restraint could coexist with cruelty, that rules could protect without caring, that safety could be temporary, conditional, and bought at someone else's table. This story endures because it refuses comfort. It reminds us that harm does not always leave bruises, that systems can preserve bodies while wearing down minds, that being spared is not the same as being free. If there is a lesson here, it is this: when people are reduced to value, even survival comes at a cost. Remember that when power claims restraint as virtue, remember who benefits from the rules and who must live inside them. If this story made you think differently about war, power, or survival, share it with someone who believes restraint always means mercy, and stay with the channel for more stories where history speaks plainly, even when it is uncomfortable.